Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Welcome and thank you everybody for joining in for this week's reading from the Bhagavad Gita as it is. Chapter 2, entitled Contents of the Gita Summarized, and today I'm going to read text number 14. But just a short recap from last week's class, which was text number 13. Krishna was talking to Arjuna in the midst of the battlefield of Kurukshetra about the difference between the body and the soul. You may remember that I explained that Arjuna was very perplexed because he was being requested to fight in the fratricidal war between the Pandavas and the Kauravas. On one side the Pandavas, the pious sons, and on the other side the Kauravas, who were unlawfully trying to cheat the Pandavas out of their share of the kingdom. So Arjuna was very upset, very perplexed, because he was being asked to fight against his cousin brothers, those whom he learnt the art of war from, those who were his relatives, his uncles, his grandfather even. So this is chapter 2, text number 14. I'm going to read the Sanskrit, as the Bhagavad Gita was originally spoken in Sanskrit, the translation, and then the purport. Matraspasas tu kunteya, sitasna sukadukada, agapama yuno nityas, tams tatikshasva bharata. Translation. O son of Kunti, the non-permanent appearance of happiness and distress, and their disappearance in due course, are like the appearance and disappearance of summer and winter seasons. They arise from sense perception, O scion of Bharat, and one must learn to tolerate them without being disturbed. Purport by His Divine Grace, A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada. In the proper discharge of duty, one has to learn to tolerate non-permanent appearances and disappearances of happiness and distress. According to Vedic injunction, one has to take his bath early in the morning, even during the month of Magh, January to February. It is very cold at that time, but in spite of that, a man who abides by the religious principles does not hesitate to take his bath. Similarly, a woman does not hesitate to cook in the kitchen in the months of May and June, the hottest part of the summer season. One has to execute his duty in spite of climatic inconveniences. Similarly, to fight is a religious principle of the Kshatriyas, and although one has to fight with some friend or relative, one should not deviate from his prescribed duty. One has to follow the prescribed rules and regulations of religious principles in order to rise up to the platform of knowledge, because by knowledge and devotion only can one liberate himself from the clutches of Maya, illusion. The two different names of addresses given to Arjuna are also significant. To address him as Konteya signifies his great blood relations from his mother's side, and to address him as Bharat signifies his greatness from his father's side. From both sides he is supposed to have a great heritage. A great heritage brings responsibility in the matter of proper discharge of duties. Therefore, he cannot avoid fighting. Om Jnana Timirandasya Gadangana Shalakaya Chakshu unmilitam yena tasmai Shri Gurave Namaha. I was born in the darkness of ignorance, and my spiritual master opened my eyes with the torchlight of knowledge. I offer my respectful obeisances unto him. When reciting the yoga literature, it's customary to give one's respect to one's spiritual teacher from whom one has learnt the teachings and the science of yoga from. Similarly, prior to reciting these verses, we always offer our respects, citing that the knowledge that we repeat is not knowledge that we have deducted ourselves, but knowledge which has been passed down from great masters, great teachers, through to their disciples. And the original teacher in this science of yoga is Lord Krishna. He's called Yogeshwar, which in Sanskrit means the master of yoga. So in this particular verse, Krishna once more instructs Arjuna to tolerate and to perform his duty and attain liberation. Here it's said that by performing our prescribed duties, karma, we obtain knowledge, jnana, which is a prerequisite for liberation. So I'm going to describe a little bit about this process of knowledge, and this is the purpose of the science of yoga. Of course, everybody knows yoga as the postures and the asanas and the breathing exercises, which is probably the most popular form of yoga in the Western countries. But little is it known that there is a science to yoga, there is a philosophy to yoga, and there is a goal to yoga. It's not that yoga is just about obtaining good health or having a better sex life or having a better looking body. But there is a deeply spiritual and purposeful direction that this path of yoga is heading towards. And it's for this reason that Krishna appears in order to delineate this path of yoga for our benefit. Yoga is meant to help us to gain control of our senses and our mind. Because being spiritual, but being involved with this world and being associated with the distractions and the realities of living in this world, we find that our minds are often distracted, often disturbed, and it takes us off into all sorts of different difficulties and ups and downs. Therefore, the science of yoga is meant to help us to bring the mind and senses under control. And what's the purpose of that? The purpose of that is that we are spiritual, and ultimately our goal in this life is being described as spiritual. Now, growing up in the Western countries, we don't have that kind of conception. We're often led to believe that the goal of our existence is simply to work, buy, consume and die. But for most of us, we feel at odds with this philosophy and we struggle with it, and we feel very empty, and we feel very as if something is amiss and that something is not quite right. And therefore within us we feel a yearning, we feel an incompleteness, and we try to satisfy that yearning and incompleteness through all sorts of different material means. But firstly, we have to understand, again, the difference between the body and the soul. And the reason these things are repeated many, many times in Krishna's conversation with Arjuna is because it's the crux, it's the very most important part of this spiritual understanding of our journey of life. Without understanding ourselves as being the spirit soul, then the idea of controlling the mind, the idea of controlling the senses, has no real value. But we can see with the mind being unbridled, there's no final resting place. we continue to speculate, we continue to carry on, and that for which we so hanker for, which is peace of mind, evades us. And that's the example given by Bhaktivedanta Swami in this purport, that happiness and distress we can't avoid. It's a feature of this world. Krishna describes that there are threefold miseries which are a feature of living in this world. No living entity in this world escapes these different things. Adhyatmic, which means miseries inflicted by other living entities. Adhidaivik, which means miseries inflicted by the material nature. And adhibautic, which means miseries which pertain to our own mind. So here it's being described to tolerate. Now, to tolerate, generally in our conception, is considered to be a sign of weakness or a sign of lack of assertion. You shouldn't have to put up with things. You should be able to say what you want, when you want, to who you want. But generally we find that that causes even more disturbance. So therefore tolerating should be there. And it's mentioned here that we have to learn to tolerate. It's not that immediately one can tolerate the pushings and pullings of the senses, the provocations, the happiness, the distress, but the object is to learn to tolerate. When we're always giving in to the happiness and distress, we find ourselves always torn emotionally, mentally, and it's very hard for us to fix our mind on any particular one thing. Later on in the 6th chapter, Krishna will describe Yoginam arpisa versham madgatenanta atmanaha Shraddhavam bhajate yomam same yukta tato mataha. And of all yogis, the one with great faith who always abides with me, thinks of me within himself, and renders transcendental loving service to me. He is the most intimately united with me in yoga, and is the highest of all. So here is the master of yoga, Lord Krishna, Yogeshwar, delineating the path of yoga. That there are many rungs on the yoga ladder, as we mentioned in the last class. But the perfection of yoga is that one comes to understand one's eternal relationship with the supreme yogi, who is Lord Krishna. How Lord Krishna is the supreme yogi, this is described throughout the 700 verses of the Bhagavad Gita. It is not that we're being asked to blindly accept Krishna as the Supreme Personality of Godhead. In many faiths of the world, we are asked to accept blindly. Now, for those of us with a simple heart, with a simple mind, we can accept that there is a God. We can accept there is the Lord. But for those of us now living in this scientific age, we require a lot more evidence. And therefore this yoga science is very appropriate, because so much is described philosophically. So many points are given to substantiate different points, and so many angles of vision are offered for each and every one of us to consider Krishna's proposition in the Bhagavad Gita. There are so many difficulties one has to face throughout the course of one's life. And the greatest difficulty one has to face is at the time of death. Just as last week we read from the Bhagavad Gita that a sober person is not bewildered by the change of the body, which is technically called death. So therefore it's described that consciousness or ourselves, the soul, we survive the time of death. Of course, we leave the particular body that we have, and according to nature's arrangement, we take another body, or we take a spiritual body, according to our progress in the course of this life. An intelligent man will appreciate that throughout the course of life, life is meant for evolution, life is meant for progress, life is meant for understanding a purpose. The great saints and sages, they say, Atato Brahma Jigyasya, that now you've come to the human form of life, one should inquire as to who am I? We may be an important person, we may be in a very high position, we may be a leader, but if we don't know who we are, then what is the value of our life? Some truths cannot be perceived purely by our own understanding or our academic qualifications. Just say, for example, when one tries to understand who is one's father. So who is the authority? The authority is the mother. So you ask the mother, who is my father? When we want to try to understand this knowledge of the self, the supreme self, then we approach the Vedic knowledge. In any field of knowledge there is an authority, and in any field of knowledge there are teachers. So similarly, in understanding our spiritual self, there are also teachers who disseminate this knowledge for our benefit. In Sanskrit, the word Veda means knowledge. In this verse also, it's described religious principles. For most of us, when we think of religion, we think of a sectarian faith, such as Christianity, Hinduism, Buddhism, Judaism. But according to the Vedic version, the definition of religion is called Sanatan Dharma. In Sanskrit, the word Sanatan means eternal, and Dharma means occupation. So the actual definition of religion means the eternal occupation of every living being. Just as there is water, there is liquidity. Just as there is fire, there is heat. So similarly, where there is the spirit soul, there is also the eternal relationship with the supreme spirit soul. Now we may or may not acknowledge that relationship, but that cannot be taken away from the spirit soul. What we do have in the world are many faiths, which are meant to help us come to understand our eternal spiritual nature. So the translation again. O son of Kunti, the non-permanent appearance of happiness and distress, and the disappearance in due course, are like the appearance and disappearance of summer and winter seasons. They arise from sense perception, O sign of Bharat, and one must learn to tolerate them without being disturbed. So that's all for today. Thank you very much for tuning in. If you'd like to obtain a copy of Bhagavad Gita as it is, you can visit my Facebook page, which is called The Perfection of Yoga. And there you will find a shop where you can browse literatures which are available. If the presentation seems a little impersonal, it's because I'm trying to present things in a way that is applicable for so many different types of persons. So until next week, thank you very much for joining in, and Hare Krishna.